Welcome and be inspired with Dominic. Hunting monsters isn't always fun, so let's do something recreational. Let's make a Gwent box.
Gwent is a card game from the popular Witcher books and games. Why am I telling you this? My wife plays and enjoys The Witcher 3 and the card game. At some point I found a set of Gwent cards online and I had to get them for her. But in the spirit of also making things myself, I wanted to make something for her to keep the cards in at least, and a board to play the game on at best. What you can see here is my first attempt. It boils down to making slightly angular pieces for the cards to rest on. To make them, I was inspired by Steve Garrison, who uses a similar jig to make slices for his wooden conch shells. I think the problem was that Steve also uses experience and accuracy on his. To make a tedious process short for you, my two main problems were A. Alignment of the piece after flipping it over. That is something I think I could have dealt with using a piece cut at the right angle already to set the fence properly. And B. Trying to work with a bowed piece of oak, feeling too rushed to actually try and flatten both sides before slicing it. I would add that most of what you're seeing here took place on the 24th of December between 1 and 3 am. For the record, I also tried using the bandsaw to cut these slices, but that did not turn out that well either. Shying away from the sanding required, I decided to take this project in a completely different direction. I started making a minimalistic Gwent board. I cut the pieces slightly wider than the cards. Did I mention that walnuts smell so nice? At this point I finally decided to flatten the bowed oak piece, or one like it at least. And since it was too long for the fence to make contact with both points before hitting the saw blade, I used the longer maple piece to support it on its way to straightness. From here I cut slices from each wood thick enough to accommodate these vintage low-budget hinges. After that I also made a cut halfway into the remaining pieces and cut it off at a rough length of a card. The same dimension that I then cut the beefier pieces to. 2 of each species. On the belt sander I then proceeded to chamfer all the edges, trying to keep them even all around. If you do not have one with such a fancy tilting table, going freehand will add more personality to the pieces. The idea is to hinge those pieces together, and if you are familiar with the board you might know what I'm going for. I put them into a clamp to lay out the hinges when I realized that I had missed an important aspect of said board. For this to work I need a line down the middle, and since you already saw me cut the inlays intended for that, I will just admit that I forgot about it at this point, plain and simple. So I unclamped the pieces and used the table saw to cut a groove into them. My fence game was not that great, and when I flipped the wood in order to get a properly centered cut, the final result turned out wider than I had hoped. So I cut some new material for inlays. Trying to go for maximum contrast, which is not easy with wood as similar as oak and maple, I glue the pieces in place. I remove as much material as I dared on the bandsaw, then sanded the rest flush. Now we go back to the clamp and the hinges. With the inlay in place, I decided that it would be sufficiently artistic to offset the hinges, thereby avoiding screws down the center, which would not have been an issue in the least. After marking the screw positions, I pre-drill for them, but realized that I should finish those pieces before actually connecting them. I use my beeswax and linseed oil mix on a buffing wheel in the drill press. After letting it sit for a few minutes, I remove the excess with a cloth and proceed. Third time should be the charm. At this point I had sanded away the numbers on the pieces, so I cannot be sure whether I messed up in putting them back together or whether my aim was off when I marked them to begin with. But, unbeknownst to you, since I did not film it, I had to re-drill half the holes on this. And here we have the result. A foldable strip that marks the important spots on a full board. You have rows of played cards on one side and room for effect cards on the other. The minimalist version basically boils down to a separator. To mark what goes where, I use a wood burner with a flat tip to allow for easier straight lines. There's melee, ranged and artillery, each with a trumpet-like symbol for effect cards like weather. And we move on to the less fancy yet equally laid part of the build, the box. To begin with, I already cut 2 slits almost through a board lengthwise, that I then turn into slices when I remove the end. Those will be the walls between the cards in the finished thing. Here I lay out the dimensions needed to accommodate all the cards, 5 decks, and the minimalist board. Can you spot the mistake I made here? It will be painfully obvious later. Moving on, I cut a piece of fur to size. This piece is as long as I thought it needed to be and should have accommodated bottom and walls. I chose that way so that the slits I cut now, using the card decks as a guide, would be aligned across all 3 sides, and they were. What did not work quite as I had hoped, due to it being terribly late, was that after I cut out the mitre to join bottom and walls, these walls were not high enough anymore. But before we get to that, I needed to add mitres to all the ends facing the small side of the box as well. And since the table saw can be mischievous with edges that small, I switched to the mitre saw, which luckily tilts that way. A sled on the table saw would have made those cuts safer as well. Instead of measuring, I worked my way up or down to getting a pointy mitre without removing actual length from the board. Duct tape makes for great clamps when gluing up mitre joints. With what now looks like the bottom half of a box, I set out to cut the walls to size and height. The side pieces, also mitered, fit surprisingly well, and I cut them to accommodate the height of the cards as well as the lid. And to fix the walls being too low, which in the end makes it easier to get to the cards, I added 2 pieces to fill the gap. They also hold the walls in place. Next you can see me aging the pieces with a wire brush. The result was nice, reminiscent of old tables where the soft parts had been worn down more than the hard lines. After I finished this using a water-based finish, most of that went away though, and I did not have the time to redo it. It did add a rustic touch though. You also saw the lid already, the first piece I brushed. It will be inset into the box using 3 of the same hinges. And a nice clasp with built-in locking pin finishes it off. Or so I thought. Here I fill it with the card decks as a final check. Some compartments could have done with a little more room, but the decks fit. But, remember when I said I had made a terrible mistake? Back when I measured the length of the box, I had placed the minimalist board sideways, and in that orientation it is wider than the cards that I used to determine the width of the box. But when I turn it lengthwise, where it would fit the width, the box is not long enough. It was one of those times when I was happy that my shop is acoustically removed from the house. Subsequently, I tried using a small mill bit to open up the wall a little more to accommodate the board, but quickly decided that I needed to go all out to make this work, which meant that the wall had to go all out. From a hole made with a Forstner bit, I used the jigsaw to remove the wall. Now the folded board fit. As a literal capstone, I added a thinner piece, and with its edges sanded to a chamfer to match the rest of the box, I feel confident in selling this as intentional. It should have been. And to hammer that idea home, I add a wood-burnt wolf head to the cap. To give it a rustic look, I sprayed it with vinegar steel wool solution, which darkens the wood considerably. Check out the video linked up in the corner for more about that. The solution I used is actually left over from that project. Probably explains why it did not work as well as I had hoped. Either way, at about 3:30 AM I put the cards in, now with rubber bands for easier removal, added the board and, while my wife will not need this, some instructions for the game that came with the cards. I hope you enjoyed this project. If you did, please like and share this video and subscribe to my channel for more to come. Suffice to say that my wife was happy about this. Thanks for watching, and remember to be inspired. And maybe I should not have left this on the radiator while it dried.
Oh, and if you're still watching and wondering about this blade, which is too long for my shop, there's a video on my channel where you can check it out. It's pretty nostalgic at this time.